I'd like to start out with a little comment to say that HASP has finally arrived. I'm not going to, carry on about this too much, but we have some parking spaces from Hope College right by A Street, and that's thanks to Kim's perseverance and Amy's assistance. And I call this the elephant has been conquered. And I thought about this as a challenge because I was reading a textbook at Hope College in our skills lab, and the editor's mother was giving encouragement to her daughter, and the daughter was thanking her mother, and she said, the daughter said to her mother, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. And I think that Kim just kept plugging away at this, and she persevered. And I think that this is a lesson in perseverance, that you keep trying, you chip away at things, and you're successful. So thank you, Kim and Amy. Great job, and we appreciate it. Thank you. This month, we celebrate Thanksgiving, and thanks to Barb Stedging for acknowledging appreciation to the curriculum committee members and the HASP members who contribute by attending classes and giving us really good feedback. I'd like to add my gratitude to all the committees and the members. And I'm also thankful for our ability to support an endowed scholarship for 2 of the Hope students. I had the privilege of attending the Fall Scholarship Luncheon this past week, and I sat with 2 of our recipients. One of them was Spencer Wesley, and some of you might know that he is our intern this semester, this year, for HASP. And he's just a great guy. He knows the direction he's going for his education, so I think we made a really good choice. Actually, he told me he's interested in running a retirement community. And after I sat and talked with him, I thought, well, you know what? I think we're going to be in pretty good hands, because he's got a head and his shoulder, and he's just a very personable person and very interested and very thankful to HASP, which was great. So I'd like to spend a minute or two what's happening at Hope and on A Street. As some of you had an opportunity to go to the presidential colloquium at Dimna Chapel, David Brooks was, I heard, a great success. I wasn't able to go, but I listened to it on live stream, and I noticed there were quite a few HASP members in the audience. And by the way, you all filmed really well. You look good. And it was great to see that all of you were there representing this, and I really enjoyed David Brooks. I thought he was a great speaker, and he had a lot of good things to say about hope and our spirituality, and I liked his speaking style. He used his hands, he used a script, and he had a lot of emotion, and he had humor. And I think those were really great elements. And actually, I've observed those elements in some of our speakers in the HASP classroom. I was glad to hear his thoughts on the importance of reading books, especially when he mentioned Tolstoy, because that was one of my goals this summer, was to read Anna Karenina, all 900 pages. And all the Russian names that kept getting repeated in every paragraph. Well, it's fall now, and I have 250 more pages to go. But I was just happy that he just said he just loved Tolstoy and how he expressed his emotions, and thought it was a great story. If any of you have read it, when he talked about Kitty at the ball and how she was rejected, because there was someone else in the ball that the captain liked. And so it's just a great story, but it's a great, precise description of reality, as David Brooks said. And in the classroom at HASP at the Knickerbocker, we had some Hope students join us for one of the great decision classes. And I was talking to the presenter who I saw at Hope, and she said she was really glad that we were there, because when the presentation was done, the students all got up and quickly left. They had to go to class. But she was glad that the inquiring minds of our HASP members still lingered to ask her some good questions. So she was thankful for that. And I think members are continuing to have fun in our film series. I heard a lot of laughter one day when I came in to have a meeting with Kim, and I took a peek in the classroom, and of course it was Jack Hyde. And he was in his element as he was interacting with the members of the class. So I'm not sure what the real entertainment was, the movie or Jack, but I want to thank Jack for making us laugh. It's good medicine, and it was just really nice to see everyone having a good time. At this time, I'm going to take a little break, and I'm going to do a little infomercial or commercial, and we're going to be talking about Tulip Time. As you see, we have some people from the Netherlands today who have been mingling in the hallway and probably handing out flyers, and Dave Tapley has been working very hard to put together our trolley guides. And actually, the breaking news in Holland is that the Tulip Festival will return in May of 2016. And if you have read the Sentinel, the Holland received rave reviews for the festival, and it was honored as the top 5 tulip festival in the world by the World Tulip Summit Society, which met, of all places, in South Korea this October. I don't know why they met there, but anyway, I was. And Nathan Box, who is an attorney here in town, received the award for Holland. And actually, he's the son of our HASP members, Marge and Bill Box. So thank you, Nathan, and thank you to the Box. But I want to say congratulations and thank you to HASP, because you made that award happen by your contribution, and you contributing to our community's heritage. 25 years ago, Dave Tapley told me that HASP and Tulip Time partnered together for this joint trolley car ride. Dave says there's a lot of changes. The script is much better. The scheduling is great. But he needs a few more guides. That's all I'm going to say. I think you've already been, talked to. He says it's a fun way to learn about Holland. And I think if you read the bulletin, you saw the testimonial from one of our members who was a guide. She had a really good time. And you get to dress in a Dutch column. And I think one of the things that I think is really great is the fact it's another opportunity at HASP to step outside the box. Some of you may not know this about yourself. You may be great at acting and telling stories and you wouldn't know it, but here's your chance to, take advantage of that by being a trolley guide. If you are interested, you need to talk to Dave Tapley. He said he's working really hard on this, or else call Kim in the office, as we all do. Call Kim. She'll help us out. We have a lot of guests this morning and new members, so at this time I'm going to have Betty Voskel come up and introduce our guests, and thank you all for coming.
It's an exceedingly beautiful day outside, right? I think 29 new people thought so too, because we have 29 visitors. And we're thrilled to have you here. So, but what I'm going to do is just to read your name and ask you to stand and just stay standing. We'll applaud you at the end. I'm not going to be able to say who you are a guest of this morning, but you understand. So let's start with Royce Winans. Marty Disler, just stay standing, Royce. Great. Laura Godfrey. Bob Godfrey. Bob Copping, did I get that right? Yeah. Great. David Ford. Gloria Ford. Mary Rita Peters. Great. Marilyn Swanson. Bruce Hunt. Cammie Hunt. David Moore. David Blatt. Carol Dirksey. Janet Haynes. Bill Haynes. George Stamus. Midge Stamus. Oh, great. Robin Williams Voigt. Okay. Brad Clow. Did I do that right, Brad? Nelda Conklin. Nelda? Oh, great. Hey, we see you. Phil Harrington. Joel Crisot. Was that right? David Boersma. Great. Fran Hackney. Did I miss? Ah, there you are, Fran. Jim and Sharon Hanneveld. Patricia Hoidinga. Neil Browning. Let's give a great round of applause and welcome. And now to our new members. And, some of you might think that I'm fudging the numbers or something. Don't do that, do I, Jean Heidemann? But I just want to point out, in the bulletin, you always see the new members listed with their mentors, and you see that this month we have 2, and yet I have 9 names on my list. We're just a busy group of people, and people can't always be here the month that they join, so that's why I have an ever-changing list up here, and we'll see how many are here today. Some people joined in August, some in October, some other times. So that's why my list doesn't always jibe with your wonderful goldenrod list. Priscilla Arnold, sponsored by Harvey Dornbus. Is Priscilla here today, Harvey? There she is. Great. And yes, if you'd come up in the front, please, Priscilla. Waltrid Beckman. Deborah Hoxbergen. I should back up. Waltrid is sponsored by Sue Bolander, and Deborah is sponsored by Jackie DeGroat. Roger Kennedy. Wonderful. Whose mentor is Chris Kennedy. Paul Lindemuth, whose mentor is Jane Lindemuth. Gary Morris, whose mentor is Tom Coney. Vicki Morris, whose mentor is Barb Coney. And finally, is Patrick Thompson here this morning, mentored by Ron Dolman. Okay, we'll try to catch him another month. Let's give him a great round of applause.
Thank you, Betty. We have a really interesting program this morning, but I'll let Karen Mishmer-Heisen, I asked her name 5 times so I could say it correctly, is going to be introducing our speaker. She's part of our program committee. Karen.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, and assuming that, can you hear me? Is this better? Yes. Okay. It's my pleasure to be here and introduce Joe this morning, and assuming that we all read the monthly bulletin, you all know about his professional career since entering the world of employment. Therefore, I had to go to another source to find out what this guy was up to before he graduated from college. Joe's the youngest of 4 children. His father began Haveman Electric, and I think that he may have earned some spending money during his high school and college summers. Having 2 older brothers meant that when they were playing games, alas, they did not want Tom around. And if they were playing ping pong, not wanting him to play, they gave him the title of the getter. So he could go get those errant balls. Joe was class president for his senior class at Holland Christian and president of the student body at Ferris. And his brother claims that because Joe is the baby of the family, he was the only one that got to go to Disney World. But Joe, your older brother, gave you a nice compliment. He said that every child born in the family was smarter than the one before, and Joe is the smartest of them all. So please welcome Joe.
I've got a lot more secrets, but I didn't.
Well, my brother warned me that Karen had called, and I could have done worse because Karen could have talked to her daughter. I went to high school with her, and the stories are far worse from high school. So, which brings me to my topic, or part of my topic, and part of my motivation, really. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here, and I know that in a group like this, I'm going to get challenged on some things. So I hope that. Hope you're kind, because maybe your facts on this topic are even better than mine. I spent 6 years in the state legislature. Prior to that, and it's probably in the bio that I had sent, I did some local government. I worked on for a construction company here in town for 10 years. My first job, really, one of my first jobs out of college was I spent down the street on the corner of 9th and Lincoln at the Home Builders Association, my late 20s and my 30s. And what I thought was going to be about a 3-year stint, that lasted 11 years, and really some of my fondest memories of Holland are that 11 years and the people that I met in the construction trades. So how did I get here? Through the legislature and working on a topic like corrections reform. I like to tell people I never came out of the corrections system myself. Thank you, Lord. We dodged that bullet. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a cop. And I don't have any close relatives that were in law enforcement or in corrections. So I truly believe it was by God's hand that I got here. There are two things that led me to this topic, and they don't go to they go far before my time in the legislature. They go to my time of when I was director of the Builders Association at 9th and Lincoln. Because once a month we would sit down with our state legislators and we would talk about topics that were important to the building trades. We'd talk about the environment, environmental issues, NIMBYism, building codes, taxes, things like that, real estate, things that we wanted to build more houses. This was during the 90s when growth was high and there were challenges against too much growth, and I was there to advocate for more growth. That was my job. Inevitably, our legislators, one in particular, State Representative and then Senator Bill Van Regenmorter, would lead the topic back to corrections. And Bill became a mentor to me. Probably one of the finest gentlemen that ever came out of the legislature. He served 24 years and just a stellar individual, and I really admire him. He's one of the reasons I ran for office. So it's ironic that I come here in years after he left the legislature and I end up working on something from a completely different angle. Bill was there during a time of the 80s and the 90s when this country was going through a phase saying that if we only lock up enough people in our country, the rest of us will be safe. If we take enough people off the streets, those that have made mistakes, those that have committed violent acts, those that are in the drug trades, if we do that enough, then the rest of us will be okay. And God bless Bill Van Regenmorter, it just didn't work. We did it for 30 years. It started really under the Reagan administration with the war on drugs. We came through the 70s when crime was increasing. We reacted in the 80s. We created the war on drugs, and then we created the tough on crime, zero tolerance policies, and we built up a corrections population 7 times greater than it was 30 years ago. In 1980, we had 300,000 people in our correction system nationally. Today, we have about 2 million people that are incarcerated either at the state, local, or federal level. Michigan had a population of about 15,000 prisoners in its system in 1980. In 2007, we had 51,000 and change. And our budget has exploded to a budget of $2 billion. Keep in mind, our total state budget is today is around $54 billion. That's all the pass-through money that comes from Washington. Our, what we call Michigan money, general fund, general purpose money, that's money directly taken from your taxes, is about $10 billion. So 20%, $2 billion out of $10 billion is spent directly with the Department of Corrections. It is the largest budget out of the general fund. Now, school budget, health and human services, variety of budgets far exceed that, but they're all federal money. And the Corrections Department budget of $2 billion is 98% general fund, general purpose money. We get very little, almost nothing from other sources. When Bill Van Regenmorter went to the legislature, as I said, he had 24 years. He had the time to learn the issue, to become an expert, to grow in it, and if something didn't get done, he was elected the next term and he could continue on it. In an era of term limits, that has changed. You come in as a freshman and you have to decide what you're going to focus on. You have to be a mile wide and an inch deep, because if somebody was going to ask me about roads or any other topic, you have to be able to answer that with some level of intelligence. But you also have to focus on one thing and try to become an expert. It's interesting, I remember as a freshman, I came in 2009, I was elected, and about a month later I was elected and sworn in on January 2. It was about a month later, my staff person who had been there for years, he worked under Bill Huizinga, came to me and he said, okay, you've got to decide right now. Are you going to run for Senate, or are you going to run for leadership? I thought, boy, I barely know where the bathrooms are. I said, I can't do that to my constituents, is get elected to this House and then immediately a month later say, okay, I'm on my way to the next seat. So we tried to excel in the correction system, and we tried to find a spot for us in some kind of leadership post, and things worked out. But that's the era of term limits. And that's the era that I left in December, of leaving a lot of things undone. I like to think that I started the conversation. I didn't start the conversation, but I carried the ball forward from the Republican Party. And what was typically a paradigm of Republicans being tough on crime, and some of the Democrats saying, we need to stand up for the defense attorneys and for the poor, that paradigm has shifted. And it is continuing to shift, and I'm very proud to say that, maybe I had a little bit to do with that, of saying that you can be a good conservative Republican from West Michigan, and you can stand up against the tough on crime movement. I like to tell people that if I believe it worked, if we could lock up enough people and make our streets safe, I was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I would write the check for it. But that's what we did during the 80s and 90s, is we wrote a lot of big checks for it. We built prisons and we locked up people. And today, I don't believe we feel safer than we did back in 1980. Crime rate actually started going down in 1982. We started ramping up our laws in 1984. I believe that the crime rate, and murder rate especially, is significantly lower than what it was in the 70s. Started going down because people just started becoming older. We had fewer birth rates. Birth rates continually gone down. As people age, they get out of that point in their lives. I talked about my reputation in high school. I like to say that if the laws were what they are today, back in the 1970s, I would not be up here talking to you. My life may have taken a whole different twist. Just a couple of statistics. 20-year-old, and if any of you have visited prisons, and I encourage you to try and do that, it's an eye-opening experience, but the one thing you will notice is it's people of color, and it's young people. By and large, the people that are going in in their late teens and their 20s. The arrest rate is about 16 per 1,000 at 20 years old. By the time you're 30, the arrest rate is 8 per 1,000. By the time you're 40, it's 4, and by the time you're 50, it's 2 per 1,000. It halves itself for each decade that you age. And I just read a quote, and I can't recall where it came from, but the quote was, if we wanted to do something significant for the corrections, or for law enforcement and safety, we would cryogenically put people to sleep between the ages of 17 and 28. And you would fix a lot of your crime problem. So there's a recognition that what psychologists have always told us is that frontal lobe of men doesn't mature until you're in your 20s. I like to say, and I can say this honestly because I was one and I raised one, there's nothing dumber than a 20-year-old male. So that's where we are. That's how we got here. We're in a country with 2 million people locked up. And part of what happened in the 1980s is we took that power away from our judges and we started to put that in the hands of the legislature. 1992, a little bit later, as I said, the war on drugs started with the Reagan administration. In 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush ran for president against Mike Dukakis. Who remembers the ad on TV? Willie Horton, not the baseball player, the criminal from Boston. Willie Horton was all over your TV screens because Mike Dukakis released him and he committed another crime. We have had our Willie Hortons here in Michigan. But every time that happens, it makes a headline of a parolee or somebody with a record that comes out and they recidivate, whether it's a violent crime or just anything else. The statistics, the other side loves to throw those statistics at us. The fact is our recidivism rate in this state is one of the best in the country. It's only about 29%, which isn't terrible. And the recidivism rate coming out of prison, that's 29%. The recidivism rate coming out of our jails is far worse. So it shows that there is a certain amount of education and knowledge that goes when people grow up, because when you go to prison, you typically are going for quite a while. When you go to jail, you're going for a very short period of time. What changed in the 90s after the Willie Horton is what's called the mandatory minimums, where the legislature started taking the discretion away from judges. And there's comments that because of things like good time and disciplinary credits, people were getting out far quicker than what judges thought they would get out. And victims were on the street saying, why is he on my street? Why is he down the street from me? Why is he in my neighborhood again? I thought we sent him away. And there was a pendulum swing and overreaction that took the discretion away from judges and put it in the legislature, and we created a sentencing grid, sentencing guideline that created mandatory minimums. And now in Michigan, if you go away from 5 to 15, you will not do a day less than 5 years. And some of that's okay. Some of that makes sense on those shorter periods. But my biggest frustration has been with the long-term sentences. The 30 years, the 25 to 30 years, the parolable life sentences, because we don't revisit those. And we do have people in our prisons, and some people will tell you that the statistic they use is that 70% of our people in Michigan prisons are violent criminals, and they should stay there. They are violent criminals. They are the violent criminals that created an act when they were in their 20s. And it's so healthy to go and see the difference of that 20-year-old with that chip on his shoulder in prison who still is blaming the world for all his problems. And you know that if he came back out, he'd still be a problem. And then go meet people your age in prison who went in when they committed that crime in their 20s. And my reaction is always, what are we getting for this? I run into a gentleman up at Brooks Prison occasionally when we go on Sunday nights. His name is Jimmy Nichols. I have a letter from him on my desk. And Jimmy is 66 years old. He's been in prison since 1975. He's in a wheelchair. And he's just a nice old guy. And I visited guys, Lakeland Prison in Coldwater is where we house most of our senior citizens in prison. And you walk through and you see a lot of canes and walkers and crutches, and occasionally somebody carrying an IV bag with them, dragging that with them, and they sit in very small rooms, and they are harmless. And if you'd put a sport coat on them, they would fit very well in this room. And I know one gentleman in particular, I met him a couple of times. He went in, committed a murder at 19 years old. He went in at 20. He's now probably 72. And he sits in a 8x10 room, and he does his artwork. And he has family that come and visit him. And he has a couple of grandchildren. And he said to me, he says, you know, my life isn't so bad. I thought, boy, you've spent 50 of your 70 years in prison, and you can say that your life isn't so bad. The cost to incarcerate that man is not the average. We calculate the average of $2 billion divided by our now 43,000 people, $35,000 per prisoner per year, a rough math. But the incremental cost for a gentleman like that is not $35,000. It's probably $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. And we have a handful of prisoners that are in excess of $100,000 a year because of their medical care. I'm 54. I know my medical care is starting to climb. we know that as you hit 60s and 70s, the prescriptions you take and everything else goes up. We are paying in excess of $100,000 a year to lock a person up for something they did 40 and 50 years ago, when they could come home and spend their last few years, and also, you're about 10 years older than you in prison than what your age shows. Your health is not going to be, it isn't good for you. It's not Club Med there. So if you're a 60-year-old man, your body is telling you you're about 70. So that's what we pay our money for. Money that should go to roads, money that should go to education, money that should go back into law enforcement to prevent the very crime that we're trying to prevent. But we react after the crime takes place. A few things that I tried to do at the end of my 6 years, and one of them is back, well, they're both back in front of the legislature right now. One is presumptive parole. As I said, that we have a system where you have to do a minimum, and then you go before the parole board at some point in time, and you have to prove that you get a 15-minute interview over a teleprompter, Skyped in from your prison to the parole office, and then they open your file and they ask you a few questions, and if they believe that you're ready to be released, then another person reviews it, and if he comes up with the same answer, then you're granted parole. Or you can, if you're not ready, they do what they call flopping you. They just say, no, you know what, you need another year. And there's no doubt that some of these people need another year or two. And they come back before the parole board in a year or two. We have a bill in front of the Senate right now. It's gone through the House. It passed the House last year when it was my bill, and it's in front of the Senate now under Representative Kurt Heise out of Detroit area, Wayne County. Presumptive parole creates a system where the parole board needs compelling reasons, and they have to be able to articulate those compelling reasons why they want to keep you. It can't be some ambiguous reason of you didn't seem remorseful or his attitude wasn't right. It has to be a reason that we found your DNA at another crime site that you weren't tried on, so we are worried about that. You sent a threat to your previous victim or somebody else, so obviously you haven't changed. Concrete reasons. And then on top of that, you needed to have served your minimum, and you needed to go through all your programming, violence prevention programming, sex offender prevention, your GED, anything else that's required by the department. You had to complete all that, and you needed to be fairly ticket-free. By tickets, that means you have no major violations on your record while you were serving. And if you can prove all those things, that you've used your time in corrections to correct yourself, then the burden is on the parole board to release you. They can't just say, no, we're not in the mood to release you today. That is one bill that I think would have an impact, they estimate, and because those that have negotiated against that bill have said it can't be retroactive, the real benefit of it won't be for about 5 years, because it'll only take effect for those that go into the corrections department after the bill is signed, which is ridiculous, but that's the art of compromise in a democracy. And those that demanded that compromise are now the very same people that are lobbying against the bill, saying, no, we don't want it at all. So that's one challenge that the legislature has, and I hope before November 15, the Senate passes that bill. The other one that I think is even more important long-term is to increase our penalties and our system on the probation side. As I said, people go in and out of jail frequently. We need to figure out a way that we nip it in the bud early in a person's criminal career, that they understand that we are not playing games at the jail level, and we're not going to let them degrade and create that kind of crime that puts them into the prison system. Now the sheriffs and the prosecutors say, oh, my lands, you're going to just burden the county cost. I see Joyce Cortman out there. We were county commissioners together. One of the biggest criticisms you will hear from every county commissioner is, oh, the state's unfunded mandates. The burden of the state putting more cost on the counties, and if you're not paying for it, we're not going to agree to it. Well, they're doing this again, of saying, well, one sheriff called it the shift and shaft. You're taking the burden from the prison and you're going to put it onto the jails. That isn't the intent. The intent is to get people corrected early. Yes, there may be an immediate increase short term, but we're going to turn people through and try to get them, instead of just a probation, instead of a slap on the wrist, to show them that crime has consequences. And we want to correct that behavior before they do the kind of crime that puts them away for 10 or 20 years, where the jail can't deal with them anymore. It's the prison system, because then they're gone for good. So there's a program that came out of Hawaii called the HOPE program. It's known as the Swift and Sure, where there are immediate sanctions. The judge looks at probationers immediately, consistently, and reacts to it. And I was at an event in Lansing about a year ago. It was kind of an award ceremony, fundraiser, and a woman was there on the day she was getting off probation, and her judge was there, and the two gave each other a hug, and she said to me, if it weren't for Swift and Sure and this judge, I'd still be in the boat I was in. So there are ways to fix people if we take that seriously. In the negotiations I was in last year on my presumptive parole bill and the probation bills, we had a circuit judge in the room, and she actually said, by the time I see these people, they've already got 5 or 6 violations on their parole or on their probation. They've got so many things that the probation officer never told us about, and I've got a basket of violations, and I have no choice. Well, Swift and Sure would change that. The judge has a responsibility, that probation officer has a responsibility to take a person and immediately say there's a sanction for that. In the old days, I remember people going to jail for the weekend. If they were drunk driving or certain violations, they'd spend the weekend in jail. That way they wouldn't lose their job and they wouldn't lose their family. They'd be gone for a weekend, but they did their violation, but on Monday morning they were still back at work. There's a report that came out about 5 years ago from the Kellogg's Foundation. It's called The Collateral Cost of Incarceration. And when we use the number $35,000 per prisoner, we forget about the cost that we've put onto a community and cost onto a family. You take a father out of a household, you lock him up, and he's got a family back at home. Now you've got a single mother, you've got kids without even an imperfect role model, without a role model back home. You've got maybe one income, maybe no income coming into the home, and you've got kids that their role model is dad in prison. You have a 7 times greater chance of going to prison if one of your parents have been in prison. And at some point we need to figure out how to break that cycle. So, and many of the men that I talk to in prison, they are all fathers. Seems like all, maybe not all, but young men in their 20s that have 2 or 3 kids back home, and they don't keep track of them anymore. They don't know who they are anymore. They don't come to visit. 12% of our prisoners ever get visitors. 12%. And we have about 7 prisons in the UP now, so you can imagine that those guys rarely, if ever, get a visitor. So what can we do to change what we're talking about? We actually have made some headway. There was kind of a doom and gloom picture, but in the past couple of years, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. For one thing, the Republican Party, my party, has woke up. We created this problem, and many of us realize that it's ours to fix. You see Republican governors all over the country, Jeb Bush, Rick Perry, John Kasich, saying enough is enough, we need to figure out a different way of doing it. It's hard to pick up a newspaper without seeing an article about corrections reform today. So it has gone from a sideline issue to a front level issue now, where people are recognizing that there has to be a different way of doing it. Not because we want to be light on people or liberal with people or anything else, but the system hasn't worked. So there's got to be a different way of doing it. What have we done right? Treatment courts. You will hear talk about treatment courts. Many of those went into effect when I was in the legislature. We have vet courts, because a lot of vets come back with psychological problems and they can't cope, and they end up in our legal system instead of getting treatment. So vet courts are one mechanism. Judge Cortez out of Wyoming runs the vet court for Kent County. It's coming. He takes referrals from prosecutors and other judges within the county, and he tries to deal with those vets on a treatment basis and not just a punishment basis. Drug courts, alcohol courts. About 60% of our problems in our corrections population stem from substance abuse. Either you were the one taking it or you were the one selling it. So if we can deal with our alcohol and substance abuse as a treatment issue instead of just as a punishment issue, perhaps we can start changing the tide. And then mental health courts. And I understand you're having Jim Haveman come next year. Jim's the expert on mental health in this state. But our mental health courts, we anticipate about 20% of our population in our prisons have some form of mental illness. And you know, we have a facility in Ypsilanti called Woodland Facility for our severely mentally ill. That's a little scary when you visit that facility. But when you go to Ionia, to one of their prisons, they have a pod there, a building, a cell block, where you can tell the men in that cell block aren't much better. They maybe don't have the risk of being violent, that they're not transferred to Woodland, but developmental disabilities, cognitive impairment, things that have sent them to prison instead of to mental treatment. And now that I'm at Hope Network, it's drinking from the fire hose all over again what I'm learning about mental health issues. I thought I was over that, but other things we can do. I talked about presumptive parole. Elderly and frail prisoners is a growing population, and it's the best bang for the buck we could do if we could figure out alternatives for them. There is a bill coming in the legislature. It's modeled after a Connecticut bill that allows the department to create a parolable status for senior citizens and send them to a facility not controlled by the department. And by doing that, you not only free up space, reduce your corrections costs, but it allows you to take Medicaid funding, which you cannot use Medicaid funding for anyone under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections. But if you transfer them to a different facility, you can use Medicaid funding. Would significantly reduce Michigan's cost on the health care. Our health care cost for the Department of Corrections is about $300 million a year. So there again, the lion's share of that is going to be taken up by our seniors. I worked very hard on a program called Juvenile Life Without Parole. Michigan is one of the few states that had mandatory juvenile life without parole for first-degree murder for anyone who is deemed an adult crime. We had, at the time I ran this legislation, we had 363 people in our corrections system. It's less than that now. The Supreme Court ruled that you could not have a one-size-fits-all sentence for juveniles. You can still send a juvenile to prison for life, but the judge needs to take mitigating factors and aggravating factors. He needs discretion, as a judge should do. A judge should be a verb. It shouldn't just be a noun. That's what they are paid for. So the Supreme Court agreed with that, and they said you can still send them for life, but you need to put that discretion in. That was not retroactive. And I had a bill that went through that allowed for a sentencing alternative for juveniles. It was the worst bill I ever passed because I let the Attorney General's office get involved in the maximum, and I can see when the Supreme Court goes back this summer or next summer and rules for retroactivity, you're going to see those 363 people probably sentenced to upward of 65 years. And once I realized that I had gotten hoodwinked, I tried to pull the bill back, and the governor's office wouldn't have it, and they said, no, you had a partial win there. I hope that the legislature sometime can revisit that and come up with something reasonable. 65-year max, I'm afraid that judges are just going to look at it and say, well, that's the new standard. Instead of life, it'll be 65. So if you're fortunate to live enough to live to be 95 or so, or 90, maybe you can see daylight on the outside. That doesn't happen. Minimum age. Michigan is one of 9 states that treats a 17-year-old as an adult. If we would just change that to being 18 years old before you're an adult, we would be able to reduce the population by about 1,000 people, 900 and some. That bill is coming. Again, the same people that oppose everything, that want the status quo, are already saying that they will oppose that. And all it would do is say that a 17-year-old needs to be treated as a juvenile. If it's a heinous crime, if it's a violent crime, once they become 18, they can be reverted to an adult court or an adult prison. But it gives a little bit of common sense mercy for some people that maybe didn't have the advantages that the rest of us did. I'm continually, and I'm not trying to be soft on these people, but you can't go into prison and hear the stories and talk to people without realizing that we here in Holland, Michigan have lived a pretty sheltered, good life. And I talk about, the things that I would be in trouble for, was in trouble for in high school, and if that was 2015, my life would be a lot different. I really believe that. I want to share one story, and then I'll see if you have any questions. As I went to the legislature, we did the Detroit deal. Took the Detroit bankruptcy, restructured the bankruptcy, got them probably the coolest thing I was part of when I was in my 6 years in the legislature. 2 of the gentlemen involved in that, directly involved, are very close friends of mine. One's from Livonia, one's from Marshall, the Speaker of the House and the Speaker Pro Tem. Speaker Pro Tem was our negotiator on the Detroit deal. Following that deal, we all patted ourselves on the back and job well done. He got to know very closely the federal judge, Jerry Rosen, in Detroit. So I still run around with these guys. I was just in New York with this group of friends last weekend. But we took a weekend in Detroit. We celebrated in Detroit a few months later, and we did a little vacation. You think, vacation, Detroit, Michigan. You ought to, it's a cool city. It is. I love Detroit. I love what they're doing. On Sunday, Judge Rosen met us at the federal court building, and he gave us a tour of his court. And it's a beautiful building. A little bit of the history of the building. Federal court building was built in the 1930s. It's an exact replica of the building that was torn down and originally built in the 1880s. So they built this building in the 1880s, back when Detroit was very wealthy. During the Depression, they tore it down and they built a new building. The judge who has the courtroom, where Judge Rosen presides over now, in the 1930s said, I want my courtroom to be an exact replica of the 1880s building. They spent $1 million replicating that room. In 1930s money, during the Depression, they spent $1 million on a room smaller than this to duplicate that courtroom. It is breathtaking. Various tile from all over the world, woodwork, artwork. It's just phenomenal. I thought the Capitol was beautiful. This room puts it to shame. Judge Rosen took us around the courtroom and he gave us, the history. And then he said, I want you to look at this picture. And if I'm at the judge's podium, the door is at the back of the room, and above the door is a painting on the wall, about that big. And he said, do you know what that is? He says, it's a junction. Excuse me, I say junction. It's an unction box. And it was a square, and in the top of it was the handle of a sword. He says, it's an unction box with a sword in it. He says, unction is a salve. It's a healing agent. It's a cream that you put on to heal. He says, when I'm on my chair and I'm looking at the defendant, when I pass sentence, I have to remember, and I have to look at that painting and remember that punishment must be given out, justice must be given out with a degree of mercy. The two go hand in hand. And I just love that picture. I ran into Judge Rosen, I think it was at Mackinac Island this past year, and I said, I have that picture on my phone. I pulled it up. He said, he remembers it well. He remembers us talking about it. And it's such a great picture that justice must be always tempered with mercy. And it reminds me of Micah 6, verse 8. He has showed you, a man, what is good, what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So, thank you. I would be happy to take a couple of questions. Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
Go without employment for at least a full year. And what can be done? What can be done to change that? I can see where the recidivism rate would be very high, because if you can't get a job, you have to feed and house yourself somehow. And if no one's willing to employ them, what are you going to do? Getting early release is one thing. Taking care of the employment problem, allowing these people to have a job and be able to support themselves, is a huge problem. And how are we going to correct that?
Great question. And you're absolutely right. I read one statistic that said that unemployment rate around for parolees was in the neighborhood of 78%. When Granholm was governor, I was the opposite party, and I didn't have tremendous love for Governor Granholm. But one thing that I thought she did fantastic was her MPRI project, Michigan Prison Reentry Initiative. She reduced the prison population from 51,000 and change down to about 43,000 and change. Almost 8,000 prisoners were expedited release. And you would think, well, boy, you're going to create a lot of problems because of recidivism. The recidivism rate actually went down when she released it. I mean, we have 95% of our prisoners coming back out. Every year we're releasing thousands back into communities. She increased that rate over a couple years by increasing the parole board size, and the recidivism rate went down even though the population went down by over 7,000. The problem she had is Michigan was in an economy with double-digit unemployment. The Governor Snyder, love Governor Snyder, I think he's a great leader, but he pulled that program back. He said it's a waste of money. I hope that in his next few years he re-implements some of it in a comprehensive way. We have a new director of corrections. She's indicated that she wants to increase prison reentry. I will say that the attitudes and the economy have helped in the past 5 years. We have people, you will see hiring signs up everywhere. People are more open to hiring those people than they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. So it's coming. That's part of my job at Hope Network, is to work on the reentry issues. We have a program called Hope Network Industries. We have a packaging plant near the corner of Roger B. Chaffee and 36th Street. And we have a lot of people that this is their first job out of jail or prison. And it's brainless work. You're taking groceries and making them variety packs and things like that, just repackaging from the manufacturer before it goes to the grocery store. But at least it gives a small paycheck, and it lets people get back into the habit of what a work day looks like. So you're absolutely right. There's a program that some people are trying to push. I looked at it briefly. It's called Ban the Box, where an employer does not have the right to put the box on the employment application to say, have you ever been convicted of a felony? I have a little problem telling an employer what he can and cannot do in his own business. We encourage people to not ask initially, because if you've got a stack of applications and you've got a third of them that say I've had a felony, it's easy to whittle it down, and those people never get a chance. So we encourage that, but I don't think it's ever going to become law where the box is not on the first application. There are certain jobs that parolees and people with a conviction should not have. If you've been convicted of embezzlement, you probably don't want to work at a bank. If you have a CSC on your record, you probably shouldn't work in a daycare center. But somebody who has embezzled could work in a daycare center, and somebody who has a CSC could certainly work behind the counter in a bank. So a little common sense. Senator Rick Jones told me that he's looking at a bill called Clean Slate. It's kind of something coming out of Washington, D.C. Other states are looking at it. Whereas after 5 years, if you have been completely clean after 5 years and no other record, no violations, no offenses, your slate is clean. You do not have to tell an employer, you do not have to tell anyone that you have a record. Law enforcement would still have you on a file, but statistically, if you've been out 5 years and you haven't reoffended, you are at no more risk of reoffending than you and I, who have never had a conviction. So 70 times 7, that's where that started out of Holland here, is to try and get people back into the workforce. That nonprofit has grown tremendously, and it's being duplicated all over the state. The best thing we have to help that problem is a good economy. Ma'am.
Yeah, I think this is on. Has Michigan privatized any of our prisons, and do you think that nationally that movement to privatize prisons in America has exacerbated this tendency to keep people in so much longer?
We dealt with that when I was in my middle term. We have one private prison here in Michigan. It's in Baldwin. It was built during the Engler days, and Granholm closed it down. It was just authorized to reopen for out-of-state prisoners. I can see both sides of that because Baldwin, frankly, has one of the worst economies in the state. And my friend who represents that area says, hey, you know, I need jobs. I can see his point. From a philosophical point of view, I've kind of changed my thinking on that, and I really don't support private prisons. One hand, they are simply the babysitter. They're not the ones sending people there. There's the judges and the prosecutors and the juries. They have the responsibility to incarcerate people. I think there is something a little warped about making money off someone's incarceration. And granted, the food service, a lot of services that go into prison are privatized, but the actual incarceration, the supervision of those men, I've kind of changed my tune on that. I was willing to go along with it, and if I were back in Lansing, I would probably oppose it. I agree with you.
I was a parole officer for the state of New York, here, sir,
There you are.
for a very short time. During that time, however, I had a lot of parolees who were released, and my responsibility was to make sure that they had a proper residence and that they were working. We're talking here about releasing a number of former inmates back into the community. Is there a plan to increase the parole officer or the parole officer staff to deal with these people? And I guess the second question is, how do they get jobs? That was one of my great difficulties in trying to provide for parolees, to make sure that they were employed properly. Is there some plan to work on that as well?
Here in Michigan, I think if presumptive parole goes through, and if we systematically try to lower our population, there is a report out called 10,000 Fewer, where we can systematically release more people back to the community without affecting public safety. But similar to the question we had already about jobs, there are three things that a person needs. They need housing, they need a job, and they need social interaction. And you know, frankly, the church should pick up a lot of that responsibility, and we have a tremendous amount of mentors from this community that are going up to Muskegon on Wednesdays or Sundays. There's a church group being formed in Ionia out of Grand Rapids. There's a lot of good things that are happening within the walls, but we need to continue that on this side as well. And 70 times 7 is probably the peer group here in Holland. Goodwill Industries plays a role in that. Hope Network plays a role in that. There are these nonprofits throughout the state that are doing this. They will need funding, and that's where I would encourage the governor that if we're going to see a savings of that $2 billion, that we need reinvestment as well. It can't all go to roads as much as we'd all like that right now. Some of it should go back into law enforcement, into reentry, and frankly, some of it should go back into an education system that educates kids that they never go there in the first place. This is a 10 to 20 year fix of trying to get that down by having fewer people go in and more people coming out. I don't know.
A very quick question. In the budget that you mentioned for the state for corrections, does that include the classes in the educational system that's going on in our prisons now?
The $2 billion, the broad number, yes, it does.
And the staff and
Yes.
the teachers and everything? Okay.
It does not include the volunteerism, which I think some of those volunteer classes, and I've had prisoners tell me that you know, the VOP, SOP kind of dictates that they have to go through, they're checking the box. The volunteer programming is actually more meaningful for them in a lot of ways.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. About 2 years ago, we had a class here on, given by a prison advocate. It was the most interesting class, and it had such a tremendous effect on my thinking about crime and prisoners and everything like that. There are many things that I learned about Michigan's prison system that's not very favorable about it. One of the things that concerned me was that the parole board, at that time anyway, was made up entirely of ex-sheriffs and policemen. There were no outside interests at all. And the speaker said that in many instances, they don't even talk to the prisoner when he's up for parole. They just say no. It changed my thinking entirely about a lot of things. The second comment I want to make is, during the last election, when the Supreme Court races were on, 3 of the candidates campaigned on the issue that they were tough on crime. I didn't hear one single voice saying that a judge shouldn't be running on something like that. I mean, I just was appalled at that. You're supposed to be fair and objective when you become a Supreme Court judge. Being tough on crime tells me that something's different. I would like to see again this class on the prisons that we had. It was not that well attended. We could learn a lot from it. And thanks again for coming.
Well, I remember that ad too, and judges typically use that line. It shows that the paradigm hasn't shifted far enough. It's changing, but not everybody's getting it yet. And I tell people, and part of when I talk in Lansing, I say this is not just good policy. It is the right thing to do for moral reasons, for financial reasons, but it's also good politics. Because I come from the second most conservative district in the state, the most conservative being the other side of Hudsonville. I come from the second most conservative county in the country. I did 6 years talking about reforming our correction system to be less tough on crime and more common sense, and I've never been criticized. Now, I there's probably people here that may disagree with some of what I said. I know that if I go talk to the prosecutor in Grand Haven, he will disagree with me. But I mean, I lasted 3 terms. Nobody challenged me on this issue. And I would say that the next time you have an election and that comes up, you should call that candidate. The League of Women Voters, I think there should be a question on that questionnaire saying, what are you going to do about our corrections reform issue? Where do you stand on it? I think every questionnaire that goes out to a candidate should include a law enforcement prison reform question, where they stand. The paradigm is shifting, but in my final comments in the legislature, when you say your goodbye comments, I said that Lansing has a few dinosaurs walking around yet. We all know what happens to dinosaurs, but some of them are still there.
We have time for just one last brief question, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for your work in this area. It's an extraordinarily complex situation. If you haven't read the article on The Atlantic on mass incarceration, it will completely blow your mind. It is such a huge problem for the African American community, and I would urge you all to look at and listen very hard to the candidates who are running for president. Hillary's way out on this. And she's really the only one. I think some of the others are starting to figure out their solutions to this, but I think it's really worth our time, certainly in this election. I'd be interested in now legislation to go after the doctors that are overprescribing opiates for the enormous heroin problem in this country, which drives us right into the mass incarceration problem. So keep on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time.